The title of our lesson is Getting It Right and Getting It Wrong. Okay, we obviously want to get it right. And in regards to what we're going to be discussing, we're going to be digging down a little bit beyond where we normally would dig. Okay, so generally in a given sermon, when I roll it out there or a given lesson, I have to dig deep and then build from the depth upward. And you're getting the topmost portion of what I have discovered, because the way we communicate in big groups is very different than the way we might communicate one-on-one. So our attempt in this is to talk about foundational level reading. Now, here's why I think this is so important. If you're really wanting to pursue Christ, you don't need tools just to better listen to a sermon. You need tools to better read the Bible. So that's what we're going to work on. We're going to work on this. Some of this is going to be a little bit academic. Don't worry. If I walk out academically and use some big words, I will walk back and make sure that the cart has not gotten stuck in the ditch. Okay? So I'll come back for you. You may have to wait for just a moment, and then I will circle back and get to you. But I generally have a feel when eyes are glazing over and we're not getting it. Okay, all right. So don't worry. If I do lose you along the journey, then you just raise your hand. You say, "Hang on a second." One of the first ways that I might have lost you would be in the way that you read the first part of the syllabus here. This is going to be an 8-week study. Okay, it'll be an 8-week study, and we're going to go specifically by genre, and we're going to make some comments on how to read within a genre. Now, a genre is a type of material, a type of, for instance, we could have Old Testament narrative. That's an Old Testament story, and our strategy for reading that is very different than, say, reading the book of Ephesians by the Apostle Paul. That's a different genre. The book of Ephesians is epistle, letter, didactic, teaching, all right? And Paul is teaching his people. And so we're going to talk through and get some strategies for reading these things at the devotional level. So you're not going to walk out of here being, expert Bible scholars, though I hope that you will continue your study and will grow in your skills in that. Because it's not the best strategy for you as a believer is to be able to handle even the most difficult of texts, to be able to walk through without feeling completely lost or at risk of getting derailed by any given teacher on any given text. You need to be able to evaluate from a principle standpoint who you listen to. Now, let me just take a quick poll. How many of you have podcasts or other sermon sources other than mine on a Sunday morning? You have some other source for instruction in the Bible. Okay, so just a few of you have some kind of podcast okay. All right, increasingly what we're seeing is people are listening to a collection of pastors. They have a church they go to and they listen to their pastor there. But then they also have other source material. Okay, now, when you know your pastor, you can intuit some of his purpose and some of his personality and some of his character. But what if the guy's on the radio? What do you know about that guy? All right, and so the more distance we get, the more likely we are to either be deceived if the guy's wrong, all right, or to be uncritical and to key on potential problems within somebody's theology. Now, I want to be real clear here. We're not looking to 100% agree with everybody we come across. In fact, we're guaranteed to hit on something that you prize as one of your understandings of a Bible verse or a concept, and you're going to argue with me. And I want you to know that it's totally okay. I'm completely right and you're wrong, but you can have any opinion you want. The main thing here is that you know why you hold what you hold. It's okay for us to disagree when we're looking at a text and we're reading it differently. But we need to know why we read it differently. Okay? And that's what we want to dig down to. So that in your devotional life, you have confidence. And if you need to communicate to a child or a grandchild or to a friend or to a parent, whoever it might be in your life, you have some confidence that what you're reading and what you're communicating are in fact what God intended. Now, we'll talk about some assumptions. Let me give you just a few recommended readings if you really want to grab hold of this topic. In seminary class, this topic is called hermeneutics. And so you can see here, this course is going to work through types of biblical narrative and types of biblical genre, rather. And there's a few course titles or book titles that you may want to read, either casually or because you're really serious. Exegetical Fallacies by D.A. Carson. All right, that's a good look at, and we're going to present one of his arguments about the places where we make errors. So the getting it wrong portion. And he does a good job of taking apart some of the ways in which we read a passage wrong. And the interesting thing about that book is you will hear many things that you have learned called fallacies in that book. And you'll have to evaluate whether D.A. Carson is wrong or whether those preachers were wrong. All right? There is a book called Hermeneutics, Principles and Processes of Biblical Interpretation. It sounds really boring, just like Exegetical Fallacies sounds. They both are boring, but they're very helpful. Okay? That's by Verkler. It's actually one of the easiest hermeneutics books that I've ever read, and I think very valuable. So there's that one. And then there's this one. This was my dissertation. I bring it up here not to be self-aggrandizing, but because when it comes to following difficult Old Testament narratives, I don't know. I use this strategy in my own study. Okay, so I built the strategy. I researched it and studied it and trust it, and it has been very effective in helping me to better read especially difficult Old Testament narratives. If you were in my Judges class a year or so ago, what we did is we went through the book of Judges using this strategy for reading. Okay, so those are a few, and in fact, in the most necessary part of what I'm going to teach you, I'll make you copies actually of the few pages. There's about 4 pages that I think would be very instrumental in your personal study. All right, so questions about what this class is going to be about. You understand what genres are when I use that word. Different types of message, different strategies for telling us the truth about the Scripture. Okay. All right, so first, biblical narrative, all right, Old Testament narrative particularly. When you get into the book of Genesis, if you look at Genesis chapter 1, and then on verse 24 is where we might pick up. Genesis chapter 1, verse 24. And it reads this way. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. Okay, and then skip all the way down to verse 31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. Okay, so what all has been created to this point? Everything. Okay, God saw at the end of each day, and it was good. And now he's created man, the crowning glory of his creative work. And he says it is very good. There's a textual difference between the completion of every other day and the completion of this day. In other words, what we're waiting for is the completion of creation. And the completion of creation, the crowning jewel, the thing that made it from good to very good, was the creation of humanity. That's important for how we apply it, because God places a very high value on people. Okay. By the way, I know many of you love your animals very much. But God does not crown creation until humanity. There is an elevated place for humanity. Fundamentally important for God's rule and God's making of things. Now, here's where we're going to get to, though. Look at chapter 2. Pick up in verse 4. He says, these are the generations. So we have the seventh day, right? God rests. And in verse 4, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the ground, and there was no man to work the ground. Okay, wait, hang on a second. When was man made? On the sixth day. So where in the world is the man hiding out here? Is this the afternoon and God made everything else in the morning? And so the text says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished. However, God had not made the man to work the field. So is there a problem here in the chapter 1 narrative? Or is there a problem in the chapter 2 narrative? Who's getting it wrong here? Neither. So work it out. How do we resolve this time warp issue that we're dealing with? Okay, so if you can answer that, you need to write the theology book. But you're going to get this question. Right? And people will look at these kinds of things, the skeptics out there, they'll look at these kinds of things, and they'll say, see, it's inaccurate. And they'll pull this apart. Now, here's where Old Testament narrative is different than the way you and I read a story. Modern narrative cannot resolve without a clear timeline. Now, you can have a bad author that doesn't give you a good timeline of things, but a Western mind, our analytical view, and all of that kind of stuff comes into play. So when we read a story, there is always a time plot that is involved that we're following. When you read a modern narrative, there is, even if they flash back multiple times, even if it gets a little confusing, there is some kind of time strategy involved in telling the story. Old Testament authors are not concerned with telling you when they're flashing back or when there is aligned parallel kind of things happening. Anybody seen the movie Dunkirk? Have you seen the movie Dunkirk? Okay, the movie Dunkirk can be kind of confusing because it zooms out in time and tells a story and then brings 3 different timelines together at the last minute of Dunkirk. All right? And it's kind of confusing. We don't like confusing timelines. We like real clear timelines. The Bible doesn't care if you get lost in time. All right? And you will. This is one of the cases. In fact, the biblical author, I believe Moses, doesn't care that this doesn't add up to us. He just rolls with it. And that's okay. You know why it's okay? Because God was okay with it. He's telling us the story. And he's emphasizing and illustrating the things that mattered most. All right? Old Testament narrative is very focused on its purpose. And if you overly pick it apart, you'll actually lose the story and lose the meaning. So if I'm concerned about what happened within a 24-hour period, so for instance, Is there something to the fact that God makes light and dark before he makes a sun and a moon? Well, I think there's something very important to that. Okay, so we're looking at both cosmic realities and supernatural realities all kind of jumbled together in this. But it doesn't tell me the chemistry of a star's burning pattern. Okay? And so it's not a chemistry book. It's a theology book told in the form of story. That's biblical narrative. All right, so next kind, and I'll give you some examples. Then Genesis, first half of Exodus, Numbers, you see them there. Many of our stories come out of these. Interesting, the book of Esther. The book of Esther is one of the most normal stories for people like us. That is, modern audiences. We read the book of Esther, and it reads a lot like a modern novel. And so we love it because one action happens after the next. There's plot rise, there's plot fall. All the things that we are used to queuing on are in the book of Esther. There's just not very much talk of God. So it seems a little outside of a Bible narrative, but it's not unfamiliar as a narrative to us. Its strategy is different. Okay, the law. First half of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Now, I want you to look at Deuteronomy. All right, go to Deuteronomy 1. Now, I want you to see then, there's about to be a restatement of most of Exodus in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? But here's the setting. And this is what might make it not so clearly law, but actually narrative. It might be narrative. Okay? These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. You know where that is? Okay. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all the Lord had given him in commandment to them. Now, let me ask you, what seems really important about the information that's being spoken right here? What takes up the most space? Location, usually Bible location is like by the tamarisk tree near Beersheba. Wherever that is. Near is relative term, right? This is quite specific. And not just specific in terms of place, but also in terms of time. 40th year, first day of the 11th month. It seems almost the end of the 40th year. 40th year, 11. We're getting into the 41st year. What happens in the 41st year? Well, Deuteronomy closes and Joshua opens. They enter the promised land. 40 years you shall walk in the desert until every one of this generation is dead. That's what God said. So this is at the end of their wandering. And Moses is preaching to the people. Deuteronomy is not the same as Exodus because Deuteronomy's context is different than Exodus. In Exodus, they were at the mountain. In Deuteronomy, they're at the edge of they're preparing to go toward the edge of the promised land and enter in. Okay, the context is different. That was before they sinned. This is after they've sinned. That was that generation. This is this generation. And Moses is about to die. The context is different. So then when you get into the sermon, what you're actually reading, you're not reading a law code in the same way that you are reading it in Exodus. The strategy and the purpose is very different. All right. So you have a law, yes, but the purpose is different than when the law is told in Exodus. So when you find differences, you're asking the question, why? We're going to talk a little bit about the why question a little bit further this evening. Okay, and then third genre, wisdom literature, the book of Job. Okay, book of Job is a lot of fun and really confusing after a little while because Job's friends seem really wise sometimes. And you're thinking, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with what those guys are saying? Anybody ever thought that, or is it just me? Okay, was anybody ever like, I'm not sure at all what that guy said wrong. Why does he get judged for that? Anybody feel that way? Okay, I've read Job several times, and I felt that way. And then I felt this way. I thought, Job's the one who seems to be speaking hard against God. And Job doesn't get judged. What gives? Okay, so how do I know? How do I know? Well, my strategy for reading wisdom literature has to kick into play, and I need certain skills in order to do that. Otherwise, and which, by the way, is part of the strategy of reading the book of Job, you know who I'm supposed to agree with? As I read what the author is doing, he's drawing me into all the very common arguments that we as people, individuals, are making against God or why suffering happens. When we use platitudes to try to comfort people when they're suffering, and that's exactly what Job's friends seem to be doing. Just these lofty kind of remarks about God and easy answers about God and all this kind of stuff. And Job doesn't accept any of it. He says, no, this doesn't make any sense. And by all rights, I'm wrongly accused. And what I want is either to provoke God to really do something so I know where I stand, but just let me hear from God. That's Job's big issue. What Job wants is not necessarily vindication to his friends. Job just wants to know that God's still somewhere in the mix of all of this. He's feeling a personal absence of God, it seems, in the book of Job. And so you know what? The author is highly effective in getting us to agree and sympathize with Job's friends. Because the book's strategy, the wisdom strategy, is to draw us out emotionally and extract our false notions about God. So it's the same kind of logic that the prosperity gospel uses. All right? Health and wealth uses this same kind of attitude. If good things happen to you, it's because God is blessing you. And if bad things happen to you, it's because God is cursing you or abandoning you. That's exactly that binary thinking, this or that, reducing God to a switch, good switch, bad switch, is exactly the kind of unwise thinking that the book of Job is attempting to extract from us. Teaches us a lot of other lessons along the way, but that's its wisdom component. All right, you go to the book of Proverbs. You hit Proverbs, and this is more classic wisdom literature. And how do I read Proverbs? Well, the first 7 verses are really the guide to reading Proverbs. Everything that we will read talks about what will happen in the book of Proverbs, the kinds of lessons that we'll get. All right. So just how do I read Proverbs? Well, I read it how Proverbs are read. They're not promises of all good things always happen to wise people. And Ecclesiastes makes sure we understand that. Okay. Ecclesiastes can be kind of a chop to the larynx, right? I mean, sometimes it's not all that fun. But Ecclesiastes says, yeah, you can be really good and really wise and bad things still happen to you. Proverbs just basically says as long as you're wise, everything's good's going to happen. They kind of hold each other in tension. That's their strategy. All right. And then, of course, Song of Solomon, and that's a special case, and we'll have to talk about that when we get there. All right, poetry. Psalms, Lamentations, portions of the prophets are all poetry. And most of those are indicated in the way just the versing is set up. And I know for us, when we read those, it doesn't seem there's any, we say poems typically will have some kind of meter. And even in the Hebrew, most psalm poems have meter that only indicates whether they're a lamentation, that is a kind of a sad type poem, or a happy poem. Okay. All right, and we'll talk about that. All right, prophecy. Now, let me ask you this. When you've read some prophecy, okay, what do you take home about prophecy? What is prophecy? When we say that person is prophetic or that Bible book is prophetic, what do you mean by that? What is prophecy? Okay. Future telling is one understanding of prophecy. Okay. Do we agree?
Well, prophecy is simply the telling of the gospel is all it is, really.
Well, so there's the idea that it's truth telling or future telling. Okay. Okay. It's not necessarily fortune telling. Yeah. Okay, so I think the majority of prophecy is preached word, preached truth. Because much of prophecy is, if you do this, you'll be judged like this. But I say to you, turn. Because if you turn, there's still time for renewal. Okay, so there is the aspect, I think the aspect of future telling is, this is what will happen if you do not turn away. We do this, okay? When we sit down with our kids and we say, listen, if you don't get a job, you're going to be broke and sitting on the curb and riding the bus the rest of your life. Okay? What you're saying to them is prophetic because you know the way the world works. It's not inspired prophecy, but it is prophetic. And what you're saying is you can change your future, but you have to do something now in order to change your future. Prophecy is more officially that. That's the distinction between it and apocalyptic. Now, there's some material differences in the way that an apocalyptic, which is like the book of Revelation or portions of Daniel or Ezekiel or Zechariah, apocalyptic is looking into, usually is looking into the future and foretelling, almost exclusively foretelling. Generally, in apocalyptic, the difference is you'll have some kind of angelic host who will take the person around and show them different things that are happening. So the Apostle John in the Revelation is not by himself. He's got an angel accompanying him and has various interactions with either angelic beings or with the Lord himself or something like that. Okay. So the difference is in apocalyptic, there's generally not, here's how you don't have to go through this. In apocalyptic, it's generally, this is what will happen. This is the conclusion of things. Prophecy is, you don't maybe necessarily have to do this. Here's what you need to do to change the future. Okay. So that covers those two, prophecy, apocalyptic. All right, New Testament narrative and parables. New Testament narrative, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts generally function like Old Testament narrative. So the strategy we use in the narrative portions will generally work. The strategy we use from Old Testament narrative will generally work in understanding New Testament narrative. Now here's where they don't work. When you get to Jesus' instruction like Sermon on the Mount or John's elongated instruction, and parables and things like that, the narrative tactic won't work alone. You need another strategy in order to understand. I think one of the biggest hurdles for us is when we read the book of Matthew and we don't understand something, we flip over to the book of Mark and we get the same story. And we say, okay, I understand what Mark's saying, and that must be what Matthew's saying. Is it possible in your life that you've ever told the same story with two very different purposes in mind? You done that? Okay. I don't think that harmonizing, now not for factual data, but harmonizing Matthew, Mark, and Luke particularly is a good strategy for coming up with understanding in New Testament narrative. Okay? Because what you're doing is you're taking You're taking other works and you're sprinkling their facts into a very clean selection. When we talk about narrative, this is going to make a lot of sense, I hope, for you. You're adding facts or taking away facts from one person's telling, and the purposes are different. For instance, Matthew. Matthew is all about irony, loves irony as a strategy. So you've got 5 apparent scandalous women in Jesus' genealogy. Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho, is in Jesus' life. Tamar, even earlier, Tamar, when Judah thought that Tamar, his daughter-in-law, was a prostitute, slept with her, she became pregnant by him and gave birth to a son. That's in the line of Jesus. So you got Tamar, you got Rahab, you've got Bathsheba. If you don't believe me on this, that these women are particularly pointed out by the genealogist in Matthew 1 through 17, Bathsheba is totally obvious, because he doesn't even, the author doesn't call her Bathsheba, calls her the wife of Uriah the Hittite.
Yeah, just to remind David, because Bathsheba didn't do anything wrong.
No, well,
Don't get me started on that.
oh, okay. I'm about to defeat that way of thinking. The moralism of it. Okay. Well, Tammy, if you want to throw down, we'll throw down. Okay. We'll get there though. No, don't you worry. Okay. But look, here's the point. He doesn't even say Bathsheba. Bathsheba, okay, he could have said her, but he points to the scandal. The wife of Uriah, not the wife of David. Right? Because the wife of David gives birth to Solomon. That's Bathsheba. The wife of Uriah, that son dies. Remember? The author it's a sleight of hand, and we don't read the story right because we just gloss over it. How many of you started in verse 17 because this one got to Mary? Because you're like, what are all these names for? You go through and you're like, what is that about? But there's only 5 women mentioned. What's the other one? I've totally lost the other one. Ruth, yes, the Moabitess. Ruth the Moabitess, the accursed people, is in the line. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then finally, who's the 5th one? Mary, who is unmarried. So why would we not expect scandal of this type to accompany the birth of Christ? And so what Matthew is saying is the evidence, the scandal, evidences that what Mary is saying is actually true. Not the other way around, but that okay, Luke loves it. Now look, Luke will punch you in the throat. A lot of times, here's what Luke does. Luke goes to the temple and he talks about John the Baptist, right? And Zechariah, the man in the temple, the high office, the guy presenting the incense before the altar, doesn't believe God. And so then he leaves, Luke leaves the temple, and he goes out to backwater. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? And he finds a little lowly woman named Mary, who is known to nobody, right? She's just trying to survive out there in desolate Nazareth. And what does Mary do? Mary believes. Now, Luke just loves to trounce on the temple hypocrisy, and he does it throughout the book of Luke. So when we read the quaint little story of Jesus' birth, we think about angels in the fields, and that's so beautiful. I want you to think about where the angels appeared. Not to anybody that mattered, but to a bunch of shepherds in the field. What is Luke saying? Luke's saying the people who wouldn't believe are back at the temple. And he has avoided them. God has avoided them. And instead he went to a bunch of nobodies and he proclaimed to them. I guess John the Baptist was probably born in a nice cozy house. And where is the Son of God born? Okay, catch the narrative. The story matters. And if you run straight to Matthew or straight to Mark to try to figure out the story, you miss the story. So, okay. I love that. Right? I love that. I get a little bit excited. Okay. And then finally, you have the epistles. These are the things the epistles are what we're most comfortable with. But even with the epistles, sometimes we get locked on word meanings and word definitions. We get locked in trying to make sense of a verse rather than understanding that the whole matters. 1st and 2nd Corinthians is not about sign gifts versus regular gifts versus charismatic gifts. In fact, that's totally not even the point. The point in 1st and 2nd Corinthians is unity of the believers and the provision of God to provide the kind of believers to the church to accomplish the works of God among the people. The whole thing is not about a list of giftings. Now, is that informative? Sure. But even Paul doesn't give us an exhaustive list that is unchanged from there all the way through any other time he gives us a verse list or a gift list. All right? So we got to be careful. We're going to talk about how to do that. All right, questions before we go any further. That's by way of just kind of general orientation of what we're going to be talking about.